Welcome to Dark Night Tellers. Tonight's story takes us back to 1862, into a world where truth was buried, records were erased, and miracles were dismissed as impossible. What you're about to hear is a true and chilling account of gifted black twins whose abilities defied science, religion, and logic itself, abilities so extraordinary they terrified those in power and were deliberately hidden from history. As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories based on deep research, forgotten records, and real historical mysteries matter to you. Subscribe, because every story here demands countless hours of digging through suppressed truths, lost documents, and uncomfortable facts others refuse to touch. In 1862, the United States was tearing itself apart from the inside. The Civil War was at its bloodiest stage, and the country was split not just by geography, but by ideology, fear, and desperation. The North and South were locked in a brutal struggle, yet beneath the cannons and battlefields existed another, quieter war, one fought over truth, intelligence, and control. For enslaved black people, 1862 was a year of false hope and real terror. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was being prepared, but it had not yet fully changed daily life. Enslavers tightened their grip, terrified that any sign of rebellion, physical or intellectual, could collapse the system they depended on. Education for black people was considered dangerous, even criminal. A literate enslaved person was seen as a threat, a gifted one was seen as a nightmare. Science, too, was corrupted by fear. So-called scholars promoted racial pseudoscience, claiming black minds were inferior to justify slavery. These ideas were printed in journals, taught in universities, and preached from pulpits. They weren't truth, they were weapons. Any evidence that contradicted them had to be silenced. Religion offered no refuge either. Many churches twisted scripture to defend bondage, while ministers warned that black intelligence beyond acceptable limits was unnatural or ungodly. Intelligence itself became something to be feared when it appeared in the wrong bodies. This was the world the gifted black twins were born into, a nation where brilliance could be punished, where being extraordinary meant being hunted, and where truth was often buried deeper than the dead. In 1862 America, miracles weren't celebrated, they were erased. The twins were born in early 1862, on a remote southern estate, where births of enslaved children were rarely recorded with care. Names were optional, dates were estimated, and details were often intentionally vague. What little survives about their arrival comes not from official documents, but from private journals, plantation letters, and whispered oral accounts passed down through generations. From the moment they were born, something felt different. The midwife, an elderly enslaved woman who had delivered dozens of children, later claimed she had never seen newborns so alert. Their eyes followed movement almost immediately, focusing with a clarity unheard of in infants. They did not cry like other babies. Instead, witnesses described long periods of silent observation, as if the twins were studying the world they had just entered. Even their physical development unsettled those around them. Within weeks, they reacted to voices, rhythms, and patterns with precision. When church hymns were sung nearby, the twins reportedly synchronized their movements, responding to melody rather than noise. Enslaved women whispered that the children were born listening, a phrase that carried both wonder and fear. The plantation owner's wife, deeply religious and suspicious of anything she could not explain, demanded the twins be kept out of sight. In her private correspondence, she described them as unsettling children who stare as if they already know you. No baptism record was filed. No proper birth certificate was created. From the very beginning, The twins existed in the shadows, present, but undocumented. Among the enslaved community, however, the reaction was different. Elders spoke quietly of old African beliefs, of children born with double sight, minds that walk ahead of time. Some saw them as a sign of hope. Others feared they would draw dangerous attention. Both instincts proved right. Their birth was not celebrated. It was contained. And in a society built on control, that decision would shape everything that followed, because in 1862 America, two brilliant black minds born together were not a miracle to be protected. They were a problem to be managed. By the time the twins were barely 1 year old, it was clear they were not developing like ordinary children, and that realization spread fear faster than admiration. While most toddlers struggled with balance and speech, the twins demonstrated patterns of understanding that stunned everyone who encountered them. They learned without being taught. Caretakers noticed that after hearing a conversation only once, the twins could later repeat complex phrases with flawless accuracy, intonation, pauses, even emotional tone. They did not babble randomly. When they spoke, it was deliberate, precise, and disturbingly correct. Words seemed to arrive in their mouths already organized. What unsettled observers most was not what they knew, but how they knew it. The twins were never shown letters, yet they recognized symbols carved into crates and tools. They associated marks with meaning instinctively, tracing them in the dirt, as if recalling something already learned. When numbers were spoken aloud during inventory counts, the twins later corrected mistakes, pointing to missing items or excess totals without hesitation. Memory, too, appeared limitless. They remembered faces after a single glance. They recalled events weeks later in exact sequence. If a person lied in front of them, the twins would exchange a look, silent, knowing, before repeating the original truth aloud. Adults began avoiding speaking freely in their presence. Doctors were quietly summoned. One plantation physician recorded that the children showed cognitive acceleration inconsistent with known development. Another suggested isolation, warning that continued observation could cause unrest. No explanation satisfied anyone. Among enslaved people, all mixed with dreaded, the children were seen as gifted, but in a land where black intelligence was treated as rebellion, giftedness was dangerous. The twins were no longer just children. They were evidence, living proof that the lies holding up an entire system might collapse. And from that moment on, their lives were no longer their own. As word of the twins' abilities spread beyond the plantation, curiosity replaced secrecy, and curiosity quickly turned into controlled observation. Enslavers, local officials, and self-proclaimed scholars began visiting under the guise of inspection, though what they truly wanted was confirmation. If the stories were false, the system remained safe. If they were true, the truth had to be contained. The twins were asked questions far beyond their years. Dates, locations, biblical passages, arithmetic problems, many of which they had never formally encountered. Witnesses later admitted, often in private letters, that the twins answered without hesitation. They corrected scripture quotations. They solved numerical problems mentally. When shown maps, they identified places they had never been taught, sometimes naming rivers and towns accurately after hearing them mentioned only once in passing. One visiting academic attempted to expose them by switching languages mid-question, assuming confusion would reveal trickery. Instead, the twins responded by repeating the question back in the same foreign tongue, asking for clarification. The room reportedly fell silent. No one present could explain how two enslaved children, forbidden from education, could demonstrate linguistic recognition so naturally. What disturbed observers most was the twins' synchronization. When separated and questioned individually, their answers matched, word for word. When one paused, the other completed the thought. Scholars debated whether this was coincidence, mimicry, or something far more unsettling. None of their theories fit. Some enslavers began to fear economic consequences. If word spread, abolitionists could use the twins as undeniable proof that black intellect equaled or surpassed their own. Others worried about revolt, believing intelligence led to resistance. One letter warned, such minds, if freed, could inspire many. The solution was never education. It was restriction. Visits were reduced. Notes were sealed. Observations were reframed as exaggerations, publicly. The twins were dismissed as curiosities. Privately, they were recognized as a threat to everything the era claimed was true. And once something threatens power, history teaches us what comes next. It disappears. What finally convinced even the harshest skeptics that the twins were unlike any children seen before was their memory. Not strong memory, but something far more unsettling, perfect recall in a world that denied them learning altogether. The twins could hear something once and never forget it. Conversations whispered on porches, arguments held behind closed doors, sermons preached on Sundays, days or even months later. The twins could repeat them word for word, preserving tone, pauses, and emotional inflection with chilling accuracy. People began to realize that speaking freely around them was impossible. Secrets did not stay secret. They remembered sequences effortlessly. If tools were counted aloud, they could later recite the exact order. If names were spoken during roll calls, the twins recalled who was missing and who arrived late. When asked how they remembered, they offered no explanation, only calm certainty, as if forgetting was a concept unfamiliar to them. Most astonishing was their contextual memory. They didn't just recall information, they understood it. After overhearing a debate about land measurements, the twins later explained the concept using examples from the fields. After listening to a single Bible reading, they questioned contradictions that ministers themselves avoided. This wasn't memorization. It was comprehension without instruction. Physicians attempted crude tests. Objects were briefly shown, then hidden. The twins identified every detail. Stories were read once, they retold them backwards, forwards, and from different perspectives. One observer admitted in his notes that their memory exceeds that of any trained scholar I have encountered. This terrified those in power. A perfect memory could not be controlled. Lies could not be rewritten. History could not be altered in their presence. The twins remembered what truly happened, not what authority claimed had happened. In a society built on erased records and rewritten truths, two minds that forgot nothing were more dangerous than rebellion itself. Perhaps the most unsettling ability the twins displayed was their apparent understanding of multiple languages without ever being taught. In 1862, enslaved children were strictly forbidden from formal education. Books were locked away. Writing was punished. Yet the twins absorbed language as if it were instinctive, not learned. It began subtly. After hearing overseers speak to visiting merchants from Europe, the twins repeated unfamiliar words with perfect pronunciation. At first, adults laughed, assuming it was meaningless mimicry. But the laughter stopped when the twins used those same words correctly, in proper context. Days later, a visiting scholar tested them deliberately. He recited a short phrase in French, expecting confusion. One twin paused, then answered in English, explaining what the phrase meant. When pressed further, the other twin repeated the phrase back in French, adjusting the tense correctly. No one in the room could explain how they recognized grammatical structure they had never been taught. Latin phrases from church sermons produced similar results. The twins didn't just echo sounds, they grasped meaning. They linked words across languages, identifying similarities and patterns with ease. When a minister misused a Latin passage, the twins corrected him. The correction was accurate. The reaction was fear. Even African dialects, spoken privately among elders, were understood by the twins despite never being formally included in those conversations. They switched between dialects smoothly, responding to the intent of speech rather than its form. Elders began avoiding speaking around them, not out of distrust, but reverence. Scholars proposed theories: heightened hearing, trickery, secret tutoring. None held. The twins were watched constantly. No lessons were given. Still, their linguistic abilities grew. Language is power. It carries ideas, resistance, coordination, freedom. In a society that relied on keeping enslaved people voiceless, two children who understood every voice were dangerous beyond measure. And once again, what could not be explained and could not be controlled was marked for silence. As fear replaced curiosity, the twins were subjected to what passed for scientific examination in 1862, procedures driven less by truth and more by a desire to disprove what stood plainly before everyone's eyes. The goal was never to understand the twins, it was to invalidate them. Local physicians and traveling academics conducted crude tests, memory trials, logic puzzles, sensory experiments. Objects were shown briefly, then removed. Complex instructions were spoken once. Patterns were rearranged while the twins' backs were turned. Each time, the twins identified errors instantly, recalling details even the examiners themselves had forgotten. One physician attempted to overwhelm them with rapid questioning, assuming confusion would follow. Instead, the twins waited patiently, then answered each question in exact order, correcting the phrasing where it was flawed. Another scholar altered test conditions mid-experiment, only for the twins to point out the inconsistency, explaining why the results would now be invalid. Most disturbing were the separation tests. The twins were placed in different rooms and given identical but unseen tasks. Their answers matched precisely, not just in conclusion, but in reasoning. When asked how they arrived at the same result, one twin replied simply, "Because it is the same answer." No further explanation was offered. Phrenology, the popular but false science of skull measurement, was used in desperation. Heads were measured, bumps examined, charts consulted. The results contradicted accepted racial theories. Rather than publish these findings, the notes were quietly sealed or destroyed. Privately, some scholars admitted defeat. One wrote that the twins represented an anomaly too dangerous to classify. Publicly, however, they dismissed the results as coincidence, exaggeration, or manipulation. Science had failed, not because the twins were beyond understanding, but because truth was unacceptable. To accept the results would mean admitting that the foundations of racial hierarchy were lies. And in 1862 America, when science threatened power, science was silenced. When science failed to explain the twins, religion stepped in to condemn them. Ministers, preachers, and church elders, men whose authority shaped entire communities, began framing the twins' abilities not as intelligence, but as something unnatural, even dangerous. Sermons subtly shifted in tone. Passages about knowing beyond one's station and false wisdom were preached with pointed glances toward the twins' direction. Ministers warned congregations that knowledge outside God's assigned order was a temptation of pride. In private, they were more direct, calling the twins a test, a disturbance, even a sign of spiritual imbalance. One preacher argued that such abilities could not come from God because they disrupted the natural hierarchy he supposedly ordained. If enslaved children could think, reason, and understand at such levels, then the moral justification for slavery collapsed. Rather than question the system, they questioned the children. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the twins were marked. Others whispered that their silence and synchronized thinking meant they were influenced by dark forces. These rumors were not accidental. They were protective lies designed to turn awe into fear. Religious authority carried enormous weight. Once church leaders labeled the twins as unnatural, enslaved people were discouraged from praising them, and enslavers felt justified in restricting them further. Curiosity became suspicion. Admiration became danger. The most chilling response came when a minister suggested the twins be kept away from church entirely, claiming their presence unsettled the spirit. In a place meant for truth and reflection, truth had become unwelcome. By redefining brilliance as sin, religion succeeded where science could not. The twins were no longer a mystery to be studied. They were a problem to be erased. Once the twins were labeled dangerous by scholars, enslavers, and religious leaders alike, the response was swift and deliberate control through isolation. Their movements were restricted. Visitors were discouraged. Conversations around them were monitored. The goal was simple: limit what they could hear, see, and influence. The twins were removed from common work areas and assigned tasks that kept them physically separated from others, often indoors or away from gatherings. This wasn't protection. It was containment. Enslavers feared that if others witnessed the twins' abilities, the illusion of intellectual hierarchy would shatter. Written records about them grew vague. Where once observers had detailed their skills, later notes softened the language, calling them clever, then unusual, then nothing at all. Some entries vanished entirely. What could not be rewritten was simply omitted. Scholars who had once requested access were denied. Ministers stopped mentioning them. Even the enslaved community was warned, subtly and not so subtly, to stop speaking of the twins. Silence became enforced, not by law, but by fear. There were attempts at obedience training as well. The twins were punished not for disobedience, but for thinking aloud. Questions were discouraged. Corrections were met with discipline. Over time, the twins learned that intelligence attracted consequences. Yet control was never complete. The twins adapted. They spoke less, observed more. What they could not say openly, they remembered. What they could not correct aloud, they stored away. Those in power believed they were winning, believed silence meant success. But history shows that when truth is buried, it does not disappear. It waits. And the deeper the twins were hidden, the more dangerous their existence became to the lies holding the world together. The final step in controlling the twins was not physical. It was historical. When their existence could no longer be managed in life, it was managed on paper. Plantation logs, church registers, medical notes, and correspondence began to change. Names were removed. Descriptions were softened. Dates were left blank. What had once been carefully observed was slowly erased. Some documents were deliberately rewritten. Early journals describing the twins' extraordinary abilities were later edited, with margins crossed out and language replaced by vague terms like peculiar or misunderstood. In a few surviving letters, ink blots and torn pages appear precisely where the twins are mentioned. This was not accident, it was intention. Medical notes posed a special problem. The test results contradicted accepted racial theories, making them dangerous. Instead of being published or debated, they were quietly destroyed or locked away in private collections. Scholars who had conducted the examinations either recanted publicly or never spoke of the twins again. Church records followed. Baptisms never recorded. Sermons never archived. Mentions of the twins vanished from official memory, even though entire communities had known them. Without records, truth became deniable. By the late 1860s, searching for the twins' informal history yielded almost nothing. No clear names, no confirmed fate. Only fragments, whispers in family stories, coded references in letters, and unexplained gaps where two lives should have been. This was how uncomfortable truths were handled in 19th century America. Not debated, not disproven. Deleted. And yet the very absence of records became its own evidence, proof that something so powerful once existed that it had to be erased entirely. What ultimately sealed the twins' fate was not science, religion, or record-keeping. It was fear. A deep, unspoken terror that spread through white society as whispers of the twins' abilities refused to disappear completely. The idea that black children could possess intelligence that rivaled or surpassed educated white men threatened the very foundation of social order. In 1862, intelligence was power. It meant leadership, strategy, influence. If brilliance could exist where it was not supposed to, then the myths justifying slavery, segregation, and control collapsed. The twins became symbols, not of hope to those in power, but of instability. Even exaggerated rumors fueled panic. Some claimed the twins could predict outcomes. Others said they remembered everything ever spoken in front of them. Whether true or not no longer mattered. Fear thrives on possibility. Enslavers worried such minds could inspire resistance, organize escape, or expose hypocrisy simply by speaking the truth aloud. This fear spread beyond plantations into towns, churches, and academic circles. Discussions about black education became more hostile. Laws restricting learning were enforced more harshly. The twins, though hidden, influenced policy simply by existing. Ironically, the public never truly saw them, yet their unseen presence haunted conversations. They became a warning, spoken quietly, about what happens when suppressed intelligence emerges. The twins were no longer individuals. They were a threatening idea, and history has always shown that when societies fear an idea, they try to destroy it. But ideas are harder to erase than people. After years of silence, restriction, and quiet erasure, the twins vanished, not in a dramatic moment, but in the most effective way possible. They simply stopped appearing anywhere at all. No death records, no sale documents, no church notes, no census listings. It was as if two lives had been carefully lifted out of history. Some accounts suggest they were moved, sold quietly to another region under altered names, separated to break their synchronization. Others claim they were confined permanently, kept out of sight to prevent further attention. A few darker whispers speak of institutional removal, disguised as care or protection. None of these possibilities can be confirmed because confirmation was deliberately made impossible. What is certain is the timing. Just as the Civil War ended and national narratives began shifting, references to the twins stopped entirely. That silence aligns too perfectly with the broader effort to rebuild history without contradictions. Acknowledging two gifted black children would have disrupted the rewritten story of intellectual hierarchy in the post-war era. Among the formerly enslaved, the memory of the twins lingered longer. Oral histories mention the two who knew, the silent mirrors, the children who remembered everything. These stories faded with time, not because they were false, but because repeating them became dangerous. Their disappearance was not an accident. It was the final act of control, not over bodies but over memory. And yet, disappearance does not mean absence. It means something was there, powerful enough that history chose to look away. 13. Why their story still threatens accepted narratives today. Even now, more than a century later, the story of the gifted black twins remains unsettling, not because it is supernatural, but because it exposes how history chooses what is allowed to exist. Their story threatens the long-standing narrative that intelligence, genius, and exceptional ability followed rigid racial boundaries. If two enslaved children in 1862 could demonstrate brilliance without education, permission, or opportunity, then the foundations of many accepted truths begin to crack. Modern society often celebrates prodigies as long as they fit comfortable expectations, but stories like this force us to confront how many brilliant minds were never recorded, never credited, and never allowed to flourish. Not due to lack of ability, but because their existence challenged power. The twins' story also exposes how institutions, science, religion, and government can align to suppress inconvenient facts. Records vanish. Language softens. Silence replaces documentation. This pattern did not end in the 19th century. It still appears wherever truth threatens authority. Most unsettling of all is this question. How many other stories like theirs were erased completely? How many gifted lives were reduced to whispers because acknowledging them would require rewriting history itself? The twins remain dangerous to false narratives because they remind us of one undeniable truth. Brilliance has never belonged to one race, one class, or one permission system. And that truth, even today, makes people uncomfortable. The story of the gifted black twins does not unsettle people because it is mysterious. It unsettles them because it is possible. It challenges the carefully constructed narratives that have been repeated for generations about who is allowed to be brilliant, who is remembered, and who is erased. History, as we are taught, often presents intelligence and innovation as rare gifts that emerge from privileged spaces, schools, universities, laboratories, and institutions of power. The twins destroy that illusion. They were born enslaved, denied education, denied freedom, and yet demonstrated abilities that exceeded trained scholars. Accepting their story means accepting that genius can exist anywhere, even where society insists it cannot. Their existence also exposes how systems respond when faced with uncomfortable truth. Instead of expanding understanding, institutions closed ranks. Science refused to publish. Religion reframed brilliance as sin. Records were altered. Silence became policy. These were not isolated choices. They were coordinated behaviors meant to protect a worldview, not discover truth. Even today, this pattern continues in subtler forms. Whose achievements are highlighted? Whose contributions are minimized? Which stories are framed as legends, while others are dismissed as exaggeration? The twins force us to ask whether modern history is still shaped by selective memory rather than complete truth. Most threatening of all is what the twins represent symbolically. They prove that oppression was never about lack of ability. It was about fear of ability, fear of what would happen if brilliance could not be controlled, categorized, or owned. That is why their story never fully disappeared. It survived in fragments, whispers, and gaps in the record. And that is why it still matters, because every erased story leaves behind a question history would rather not answer. How many truths were buried simply because they did not fit the narrative?